Welcome back to nvRanger and Co. I hope you're all doing well. Today's going to be a long one, so sit back, relax, grab a coffee, a tea, whatever your heart desires, and get ready. An employer who wants their identity to remain anonymous has tasked us with heading back to the East Coast. But instead of checking out the capital wasteland, this time we're going to check out the Commonwealth wasteland. If you're new to the process, our goal here is to assess each and every town in a region and then rank it based on its livability. But something you have to keep in mind under this context is that you are not the main protagonist, and in this case, you're not the sole survivor. In fact, let's just pretend the sole survivor never woke up from cryo-freeze. They're staying buried in Vault 111. You are entering the Boston Commonwealth as if this were a real-life scenario. You have to go and survive in the wasteland, find your way throughout your new life. This means you're not respawning, you're not going off and fighting raiders, super mutants, and deathclaws and expecting to live. You can't absorb bullets and radiation like it's a series of paper cuts. You have to take this a bit more seriously. This also means we expect the other inhabitants of the world to function a bit more realistically. They're not just going to stand around in one location waiting for the main character to show up. Another thing I have to note before we begin our process is that if you're familiar with Fallout 4, you'll know there aren't very many towns in the traditional sense, at least, because so many locations were created to be settlements that the player would eventually build up and expand over time. We're still going to assess many of these locations as long as they have some settlers in them to begin with, but again, keep in mind you're not the sole survivor, so you're not this land developer god. You're not going to be able to build up a settlement and do construction work within a few hours. This is going to be a process that takes a lot of people and time, not to mention resources. Before we begin, a quick reminder as to how we judge the various towns. We take a look at the housing. Do they have a doctor? What is the trading like? Do they have a clean water source and food? What is the safety and defense like? What is the leadership like? And finally, the potential for work and the potential for growth. All right, so starting up here in the northwestern corner of the map, we have the Abernathy Farm, owned and operated by the Abernathy family. The housing situation here is quite clear. It's one enormous wooden and metal shack, quite unstable looking, built onto this high voltage pylon. This is just one pylon in a series of them, and if you've ever seen these in real life cutting through forested areas, you'll know they provide a pretty decent clearing the Abernathys have taken advantage of to set up their farm and their homestead more generally. There's also this trailer that isn't too far. Now, I don't think you'd want to move into this and be all the way out here on your own, but maybe you could get some help from them to drag this thing a bit closer, maybe use their Brahmin, and then you could have a nice little private setup on their homestead. They do have an open bed within their large shack, but that's because one of their daughters was killed recently, so I'm not sure how they would feel about you sleeping in that bed. There is no doctor here, but there is a bit of trading with Connie Abernathy, the mother of the family. She does have a limited inventory, and that's sensible given where she's located. They do have a clean water source. Apparently, the water pumps in the ground provide clean water, so we'll find that most settlements have a source of clean water, which is very different if you watched the Fallout 3 video. For food, of course, it's in the name, and as we discussed, they have a farm here. They have a really good-sized potato farm running, and then they have a smaller section for melons out back, so there's a bit of variety. And if you're familiar with this area, you'll also note that there are rad stag that commonly roam the area, so you have a good hunting setup as well, and of course they have a cooking station. I can't forget they also have Clarabelle, their Brahmin, who would provide them Brahmin milk and fertilizer. Now for safety and defense. Again, their daughter was recently killed by raiders. These are the raiders coming from that satellite station, Olivia, which is pretty far away, but they still pose a threat apparently, and they have very little in the way of defending themselves. They're armed, as Blake will tell you when you show up to the settlement, and they could get a vantage point on top of their home, so it's not the worst in the wasteland, but it's also nothing close to the best. The leadership seems to be Blake, the father of the family, but leadership isn't of the greatest concern here given it's a small family unit. For potential work, you could work the farms with them. Of course, this is an option even in-game, hunt for rad stags, and I think it would be a huge benefit to them to help build up some better defenses. In a lot of the towns and cities we've discussed in this series, you might have the option to set up a business, but because of the limited economy of a lot of these smaller settlements, that's not realistic. I think your best bet in a place like this or many of the others we're going to discuss is to just make yourself as useful as possible, not only to yourself, but those around you. The difference being you're looking to provide bare necessities. You're trying to make sure needs are met rather than providing goods and services. So let's get into more of a general discussion around Abernathy Farm and its potential for growth. So they're generally wary of you upon arrival. We're not sure that they would be open to outsiders, which is something you have to consider. They're towards the northern section of the map, which generally seems to be safer. Now they are harassed by those raiders over at the satellite station Olivia, and then you also have the raiders at Concord and ghouls down at the Wicked Shipping Fleet lockup. I think for our context, it's more sensible to consider the raiders at Concord rather than the raiders at the satellite station Olivia because they're pretty far away, not to mention they are much closer to Tenpines Bluff. Luckily, unfortunately, the raiders at Concord are probably going to wipe out the Minutemen, so no more of them, but hopefully the raiders will be hurt a little bit and have their numbers dwindled. The settlement is really far away from any points of interest. It's not centrally located, so it's going to be hard for them to gather newcomers and gain strength through numbers. This also leaves them vulnerable to raiders, but there aren't that many raiders up here. There's not a ton of dangers beyond them, and it seems that they can work with them as long as they provide some sort of tribute, provide them with food to hopefully leave them alone. Their daughter seems to have been killed for trying to stand up for herself, and to be honest, in this world, she really shouldn't be doing that. Just give them a couple of potatoes and melons, provide them with some food, pay them tribute, and they'll leave you alone. They're not the only settlement in the wasteland dealing with this, it's just kind of a part of life. I think the better plan for growth with many of these settlements, including the Abernathy Farm, is to potentially talk to some of the caravans, help them spread word to people looking for a place to settle down that isn't in the more dangerous areas of the Commonwealth, build up your numbers, and then the raiders slowly but surely become less and less powerful. You can sort of balance out the power dynamic here. In the meantime, farm your land, accumulate enough to feed yourself, and then have excess for the raiders, and then start gathering ammunition, weapons, and people, trustworthy ones hopefully, when the opportunity presents itself. It seems to be clear through various points of dialogue that the raiders and the gunners, even to some extent, can be reasoned with in the Commonwealth. They're not like the fiends of New Vegas, and they're surely not like super mutants or feral ghouls. When it comes to the Abernathy Farm, for now I'm going to put them into C tier here. That could definitely change as we proceed. Each location can be shifted in position all the way up to the end because, of course, they're going to be ranked relative to one another. And I feel that Abernathy Farm, when I consider these other settlements out in the middle of nowhere, does have a bit of a leg up. So I'm going to put it into C. So that's one settlement down. Most of the others will move a bit quicker. That first one is just used as a bit of an example. Now we'll move a bit to the northeast and head over to Tenpines Bluff. For the housing here, we have one very small shack with 2 beds in it, and then there's one destroyed house, which is mostly just the foundation remaining, and it has 3 rad roaches in it for you to snuggle up next to. I am very judgmental when a town has actively hostile entities within it, or it has dead animals or people within it. This is a huge red flag. It speaks to the lack of awareness of its current members. And because there's no extra room in the current little shack that they have, when you go to lay your head down in this mostly destroyed home after a hard day of farming and get bitten up by rad roaches, there's no doctor here to help you out afterwards. There's also no trading in town. Now you can always consider the fact that many of these locations are going to be a stop point for caravans, but when we talk about trading, we're really considering what's in the location consistently. For clean water, yes, they do have a water pump, and for food, they have a potato farm. Not a lot of variety, but there is a cooking station. You can always hunt, but I think hunting is a lot more risky than farming because you can quickly go from being the hunter to the hunted, and that ties into the safety and defense of this location. It's even worse than the Abernathy Farm, who at least have a tower and a vantage point in a field. Tenpines Bluff is in a really rough location. Don't get me wrong, there's not a ton of dangers around it given it's in the northern section of the map, but they're still very close to that satellite station Olivia, and it makes more sense for the raiders there to be posing a threat to the people of Tenpines Bluff rather than the people of Abernathy Farm. At the Abernathy Farm, because of the geography of the area, you could have a lookout on top of the home who would have a pretty good view on the area around them because of the geography. But here at Tenpines Bluff, it seems like you could very easily get ambushed. It's not a great location. There's nothing really approximating leadership here. You have 2 unnamed settlers, and for potential work, you're pretty limited. Again, you could go hunt, you could help out on their tato farm, or maybe try and find some new crops to introduce to their diet and help build defenses. For the potential growth of Tenpines Bluff, you're really in a bad situation here. There's not any major population centers nearby, you don't have a whole lot of farming, and there's not even a roof to go over the heads of any newcomers because their current shack is so small. You're also 1 settler choking on a dry tato away from being not even really a town anymore, if you could even call it one to begin with. So this is going to be our first settlement headed into F tier. Moving further east into the south a bit, we have the Greentop Nursery, which has 1 pre-war house and 1 shack built onto it with 2 beds inside of it. For some reason, the 2 settlers that live here currently don't live within the pre-built pre-war home. They live in a shack they built on the outside of it. I'm not sure why, but it gives some extra room for newcomers. Again, we still don't have a doctor, there's no trading within town, but they do have a clean water pump, and for food they have a mute fruit farm in a large greenhouse. I think they should probably diversify the crops that they're growing. I don't know why they're only growing mute fruit, but that's the case. For safety and defense, we have some more of that Fallout 4 strangeness. They complain about ghouls all the way down here at the National Guard training yard, but they have a group of super mutants over at this medical center or hospital. There's ghouls in the Malden Middle School, and then you also have more super mutants really close by at Breakheart Banks. But again, for some reason, they're concerned with the ghouls down at the National Training Yard. Don't understand that. And potentially even more concerning, you have a Deathclaw nesting in the Old Gullet sinkhole right next to their settlement, so they're in all sorts of danger and they're looking in the wrong direction. For leadership, again, you don't really have any, it's just 2 unnamed settlers, and for work, very similar to what we've discussed so far, you can help them work the mute fruit farm. I think you should probably spend your time trying to set up some sort of defendable location here though. That's going to be your main priority because there's a lot of dangers around them. For potential growth to their benefit, they do have a solid amount of structures here. They have the greenhouse, which I don't really think does greenhouse things in its current state, but then they do have that old home attached to their makeshift shack for newcomers to join into. On the bright side, there's not a ton of raiders or gunners nearby, which means your enemies aren't going to be quite so cunning. You're dealing with animals more so, and then super mutants and feral ghouls. I think given that reality, your best bet is to find a way to hide whenever trouble comes by, which they do have some sort of opportunity to do, whether they can get on top of their shack or their house, something like that. The Deathclaw will probably be able to smell you, the super mutants will be pretty dumb and just pass on by. If they don't notice anything, they might steal some of your stuff, but that's better than them stealing your life. For those reasons, I think we're going to put Greentop Nursery into D tier. The next location might be the first one that finally starts to look like a town. Here we are in the Slog. For housing, we're off to a really good start compared to the other locations because we have a concrete building with about 8 or so beds in it, and then you have a small shack built onto the side of it for Arlen Glass. And I know this isn't quite within the game's settlement bounds, but we also have a locked diner right next to it, so you could use something like this. I don't see why not. You might be in a bit more danger because you're not with the rest of the group, but if you could form some sort of home out of this, you would have a bit of privacy. We still haven't found a proper doctor, but we do have trading here with Deirdre. Again, she's going to have a limited inventory. We do have clean water with a water pump here, and then for food, we have a lot of variety. We have corn, carrots, a couple of wild mute fruit nearby, not to mention the giant tarberry pool, and then you have a cooking station. For safety and defense, we have a chain link fence. Now this isn't overly relevant to human enemies, but if you have some animals coming by, it might detract them. We also have a solid concrete structure, which is much better to defend yourself from rather than the wooden and metal makeshift shacks we've seen in the other settlements. We also have these diving or sunbathing platforms that could be used as a vantage point for a lookout. I'm not sure what the purpose of these was in the pre-war though. Maybe this lake was more full and people were jumping into that. Maybe it's just a place to sunbathe. I'm not sure. If you have a better idea, drop it below. I'm really not sure. But we do have a lot of dangers to consider. We're very close to the Hub City Auto Wreckers, which is full of gunners, the Saugus Ironworks full of raiders, and again the Dunwich Borers, which is also full of raiders. You have a lot of serious threats around you. And similar to the Greentop Nursery, we're still really close to the Breakheart Banks, which is full of super mutants and their hounds. Big threat. For leadership, you have the Wisemen, and this seems pretty necessary because you do have a larger group of people here. This is the biggest settlement we've looked at so far. For potential work, a lot of the basics, help out on the farm. Maybe you could even help Arlen Glass build something. He is a toy mechanic, but if you can work with him to construct better safety and defenses, you could really help out the community and become an integral member. For potential growth, we have a lot of positive factors. It's well known on the caravan circuit, so word can get around about the Slog. It's only full of ghouls right now, but you could definitely have people showing up. The Wiseman seems completely open to that. They have a lot of farming, so they could support the people based on their food accumulation, but the one big issue is that there's not a ton of room or accommodations for new settlers to come in. You could add in a person or two, but if this place starts filling up, they're going to have a room and a housing issue they'll have to address, and that could be benefited by that additional diner not far away. On the downside, you have a ton of threats like we talked about, especially with the Saugus Ironworks Raiders and the Hub City Auto Wrecker Gunners, not to mention there is a Deathclaw spawn point across the water from them. Not a huge threat, not as big as the other two we just mentioned, but it's still relevant. The Slog is in a really interesting situation that makes it difficult to rank because of those dangers around it. Now, you kind of could hope that the Saugus Ironwork Raiders and the Hub City Auto Wrecker Gunners would run into conflict with one another. Maybe you could go in and try and bribe one to help defend you from the other by offering them tribute, giving them a lot of crops and other supplies. That's a dangerous game to play though, that can turn on you really quickly. On the other hand, the numbers, not to mention Arlen Glass being a couple 100-year-old mechanic of sorts, could be a huge boon to the community. Make some good decisions when buying from the caravans, buy some turrets or some weapons that he could set up, and you could turn the Slog into a really well-defended community. If the Slog is well-defended and difficult to invade, the Raiders or the Gunners might think twice before going at it. The more resources and manpower they have to commit to an attack on the Slog means they have to leave themselves that much more exposed to one another, so it kind of could play well into your hand, and for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and put the Slog in C tier, but above Abernathy Farms. Next up, we have the Finch Farm, which I'm not going to be so forgiving to. For housing, they have one medium-sized shack. At least it's bigger than the Tenpines Bluff shack, but you have more people here, so it ends up balancing out. Again, no doctor. You do have some trading with Daniel Finch, and there is clean water. For food, they have a diversified farm. You have razor grain, mute fruit, and corn with a cooking station, and you do have some wild Brahmin nearby, but they're not captured for some reason. I feel like somebody should go wrangle them up. Their safety and defense situation is abysmal, and not to mention their son went to join the Saugus Ironworks Raiders, which is a big yikes. That's pretty embarrassing. Now again, you have those Raiders, they're right next to the Gunners. Maybe they cause issues for one another, and that makes it more difficult for them to go raid settlements, but that's not the real issue here. I think one of the biggest concerns that gets left largely unmentioned is the enormous satellite array that is a massive super mutant compound. The Revere satellite array is just to the south of them, not to mention to the southwest you also have the National Guard training yard. This location is central to a ton of hostile components. They're in a bad place. They are under the leadership of Abraham Finch, who seems to have driven his son into becoming a raider. Seems like a good guy. For potential work, again, help out with the farm. I think you would prove yourself very useful by wrangling the nearby Brahmin, and then building defenses, although I think you'd just be wasting your time. This place is bound to get wiped out. When considering potential growth, you are sandwiched between a ton of dangers, and that's a sandwich you cannot eat. You have poor leadership, defecting members, and a location that belongs in F tier below Tenpines Bluff. Triple F for F Finch Farm. Okay, had to stop off at the Drumlin Diner for a mute fruit jelly and peanut butter sandwich because my stomach growling was getting into the recording, but now we can pick back up at the county crossing. This is another dinky little settlement with one small shack and 2 beds for the 2 current nameless residents, and then again, kind of like Tenpines Bluff, we have another destroyed home with mostly just the foundation remaining. Luckily this time there's no rad roaches inside of it. 6 settlements in and we still haven't met a doctor. There's no trading here. We do have a water pump for a water source, and then they have a decent sized mute fruit farm. For safety and defense, again, we're largely undefended here, and they're near a feral ghoul pack at the National Guard training yard. They're the closest to this location. They are also still pretty close to the super mutants at the Revere satellite array as well. There's no leadership here, and for potential work, the standard, work on the farm, help defend or build defenses. For the potential growth, it's terrible here. Just leave. In fact, I think that the people at the county crossing, the Greentop Nursery, and Finch Farm should all drop everything that they have there, only take what they can carry, and head over to the Slog so they can get a proper town in this area and get some numbers on their side. I'm going to put County Crossing above Finch Farm but below Tenpines Bluff in F tier. I think it's still really bad, but they're a bit further away from the dangers that Finch Farm has surrounding it, but they're not as safe as Tenpines Bluff could arguably be. Let's also knock out Nordhagen Beach while we're down here, which is situated on this peninsula near Libertalia and Fort Strong. I'm sure this will be a good one. They have one small beach shack with 3 beds for the 2 adults and 1 child that currently live here. Again, no doctor, no trading, 1 water pump for a water source, and they have a small gourd farm going. Its safety and defense is quite bad. They're near Fort Strong, which is full of super mutants, and they're very close to Libertalia, which is a massive raider encampment. They're in a bad spot here. Now, they are kind of close to the Boston airport, and eventually there's a quest involving them and the Brotherhood of Steel, but this isn't very useful right now. They'll be waiting for the Brotherhood of Steel to show up, hopefully before they get taken out by one of those other 2 dangers we mentioned. I also don't think the Brotherhood of Steel is going to prioritize helping them out even when they do arrive, so doesn't count much towards anything. For leadership, again, you have a family that lives here with 2 parents and 1 child, and there's a literal pile of trash next to their home, so they don't seem to care much about their living situation. For potential work, it's the usual. Maybe you could fish and end up attracting some mirelurk towards you to put you out of your misery. Really not a lot to go off of here. And for potential growth, again, bad situation, small farm, small population, and near significant dangers in Libertalia and Fort Strong. This place is going to get wiped out if it doesn't disappear in a high tide. Breathing in an irradiated sea breeze probably isn't good for you either, so I'm going to put this one in F tier just above Finch Farm but below everything else. It's pretty much a toss-up between these 2. At our 9th location, we've finally arrived at something approximating a proper town in Bunker Hill. For housing here, you do have a significant amount of shacks within the settlement with beds and bedrolls, and you have a motel run by the Savaldi family. Finally, we have a doctor in Doc K, and then for trading, this is a caravan hub. You can find various traveling merchants showing up here regularly, not to mention K for medical supplies, Deb for general goods, and then you have Joe Savaldi running the bar in town. We do have clean water here in Bunker Hill. You have a Brahmin in the pen, and then you have a couple of patches for small farms growing tato and corn. They also gather a lot of food and water, I'm assuming through trade, because this is a hub for the caravans. For safety and defense, you're surrounded by walls on a raised position, and you also have the massive Bunker Hill Monument to use as a vantage point. We do know Bunker Hill relies on some form of mercenary support from other threats, but they do pay protection fees to the raider gangs in the area, so you're pretty safe here. It's not a great situation, but you're defended at least. We also should note that Bunker Hill is the site of a major battle between a lot of the factions in the area as the story progresses, so that's something that could end up being relevant in our scenario. We do actually have a proper form of leadership here with Kessler, and then for potential work, you can help defend the town or maybe help expand their current farming situation because it is quite limited. The more self-sufficient they are, the better. You could also offer some sort of service to the caravans, help tend to their Brahmin whenever they come into town, or hop on with one of the caravans even. For the potential of growth here in Bunker Hill, I think they're in a pretty good situation. They're able to pay off raiders, which means there's something of an economy here. They're a hub of trade. There is a bit of farming and they have water, so they're pretty self-sufficient, maybe not perfectly, but the rest can be supplemented by the trading caravans. There isn't a ton of room in town left to expand, but a lot of the space seems to be given to the trading caravans, which I think could be limited a bit more to allow the town to grow and have more of a standing population. The trading merchants shouldn't be given priority to some of the shacks. They're used to throwing down a bedroll and sleeping under the stars anyway, and given the amount of Brahmin passing through, not to mention the one the town already has, you could be collecting a lot of fertilizer and growing a really good farm here. And Bunker Hill sits in an interesting situation where it's not as deep into the urban sections of Boston like Goodneighbor or Diamond City. It's not all the way out in the completely rural sections with places like County Crossing. That paired with all of the trading caravans moving through here could lead to a higher amount of newcomers and better potential growth. We still have to consider that they have to pay off raiders to leave them alone, which could go wrong at any moment, so that's going to limit Bunker Hill to B tier for now. They also don't have a proper security detail or defense in that regard, so we can't put them quite up there in the A or S tier. And just when you thought we were getting deeper into the city, we're back out in the boonies with the Oberland Station. This one's pretty bad. For housing, all we have is some sort of train traffic control tower, I'm guessing, with one bed and one bedroll in here. There's no room left. They don't have a doctor, they don't have any trading in town, they do have a clean water source at least, and they do have a pretty decent Tato farm going with a cooking station. Hope you like Tato soup because that's all they're cooking. For safety and defense, they do have a chain link fence which could help out with some minor amounts of wildlife, and they do have a vantage point from the tower, but this isn't especially useful because the area that they're in is pretty hilly and densely forested, so I don't think it provides that much of a benefit. They're near the super mutants across the river at the water treatment plant, which shouldn't be too much of an issue, but then at the Beantown Brewery close by, they do have raiders, so that is an issue. There's nothing really approximating leadership. They only have 2 unnamed settlers, and for potential work, you have your usual working the farm, helping defend, or maybe hunting. For potential growth, this isn't the best, but there are some things to consider that are a little bit unique. We do have a relay tower nearby, so maybe you could send out some sort of broadcast to get newcomers to show up, but there's some dangers in that. And then you do have Vault 81 nearby, so if some people wanted to leave the vault and actually see the sun, live under the sun, maybe you could get them showing up to your settlement and helping you out. They're also right next to a set of train tracks, of course, so maybe you could get one of those little man-powered hand cars and shift yourself around the Commonwealth. I suppose that's an option, until you run into something obstructing the tracks, of course. The Oberland Station does have some potential positives, and it doesn't have a lot of pressing dangers right next to it, at least compared to some of the other settlements we've discussed, so I'm gonna go ahead and put it in D tier above Greentop Nursery. And we just mentioned it, so we might as well move on to Vault 81. For housing here, you have many rooms within the vault, but they are mostly occupied by the current residents. You could obviously use the one that eventually gets opened up for the sole survivor, and you might be able to move into one of the underused storage rooms. For doctors here, we have a great situation, even better than what we have in Bunker Hill. You have Dr. Forsyth and then his assistant, Dr. Rachel. That's a major positive for Vault 81. For trading, it's not great, but you do have a couple people to trade with. You have Alexis Combs, who runs a general goods store, and then you have Maria Somerset, who's a food vendor who operates out of the cafeteria with her husband. This vault, like most, has a water purifier, so you do have clean water here. And then for food, you have Dr. Penske, who grows food in her lab. She has corn, carrots, and melons, and then they also clearly trade for food with outsiders. For safety and defense, it doesn't get much better. They have a secured vault door with turrets on the outside, not to mention vault security. There are some dangers though. They do have those diseased mole rats in the closed off section of the vault. They're unlikely to pose a real threat as long as they stay locked out. The problem is Bobby DeLuca discovered one of these secret entrances to store his chems. Austin Angle, the annoying little kid who tries to hustle you as soon as you get into the vault, he ends up seeing Bobby going in and using this entrance, so he goes in to investigate with his childish curiosity and gets bitten by one of the mole rats, and this is where a disease is contracted and we start to have issues. You see, Vault 81 was originally going to be used for human experimenting like many of the other vaults, but their original overseer, Dr. Olivet, caught on to Vault-Tech's plans. She was told of them, I believe, and she got in their way. She didn't let them happen. So most of the Vault 81 residents never find out that they were supposed to be guinea pigs to a bunch of different diseases. This is kind of a good thing because it keeps the vault stable and calm, but it also leads to a major blind side, a huge amount of ignorance as to what lies just on the other side of where they live. There's so many different ways this could lead to various issues, especially since a chem fiend is the one who knows how to access this part of the vault that is inhabited by diseased mole rats. It also should be mentioned that the vault is allowing in traders, which increases the potential of an infiltration or an ambush, given a vault would be a worthwhile target for groups like the Gunners or Raiders, of course. The person who opened up the vault to outsiders was their leader, Overseer Gwen McNamara, who doesn't seem like a terrible leader, all things considered. The vault does need to sort of change how they're doing things and expand upon their operations. She is known to have doubled a lot of the work for those who live within the vault, but people out in the Commonwealth have to work all the time. I think the people in the vault are just a little bit soft, to be honest. Now for potential work, and this is entirely dependent on your ability to gain entry, which is not promised at all here. You could help Dr. Penske in her food lab. You could help out with vault repairs and maintenance because they clearly need help there. You can also help with Dr. Forsyth in the medical lab. You could join the vault security, assist one of the few small businesses inside the vault, teach and assist in the school, or even do janitorial work. I think your options are really open here. This is one of the better spots for potential work. The potential for growth, despite the limited space, isn't terrible, especially because you have people like Dr. Penske who are growing their own food within the vault. And perhaps if some situation did occur where the vault became aware of the other side of it, where there are mole rats, maybe they clear them out, some of them get infected and get diseased, who knows, maybe that ends up leading to a few deaths, where you have some open space in the vault. Even if the people don't die, if they do end up clearing out the other section of the vault, that gives them a lot more room. That's a lot of ifs though, and you still have to consider if they will allow new people to come in spades like that. How many people are they really willing to allow to live within their home? They allow the sole survivor to, but that's after going to great lengths to help out a member of their community, a child no less. And asking to live there seems quite a lot because the residents are generally not very trustworthy of outsiders. It seems they only really allow access to trusted traders. You're not going to be allowed in unless you're a charismatic individual with a Pip-Boy and a vault suit, or you bring them some fusion cores. So your hands are sort of tied here. This isn't going to be the easiest place to get into, let alone gain a residence in. I think if you wanted to get entry and residence into Vault 81, you're going to have to really prove to them that you're worthwhile and trustworthy, which could end up putting you in a lot of danger. That's something you're not looking for here. We're not the sole survivor. You're not invincible. You don't get to respawn. So if they ask you to go get fusion cores and you have to go to a lot of dangerous locations where you could end up dead, that really hurts this in terms of our ranking for the best towns. So I'm gonna go ahead and put Vault 81 at the bottom of C tier. Now I think you'd be better off making an attempt trying to, or at least talking to them over places like Oberland Station and all the way down through Finch Farm, of course, but you might have a better chance at surviving if you just head over to a place like Abernathy Farm or the Slog, not to mention Bunker Hill. If the context was you were born into these settlements, no problem, sure, we can put this in A tier or even S tier as long as you don't mind never seeing the sun, but that's not the context. You're just kind of being placed randomly in the Commonwealth, hopefully not inside of a Deathclaw's mouth, and then you gotta wander to one of these locations. So Vault 81 really is hurt by its means of access. Before we head further south, I have to go back up north. We can't forget Covenant. This is a pretty legitimate little town in the middle of the Commonwealth. You have 4 houses with various couches and beds inside of the town, and then for a doctor, we do have Dr. Patricia Montgomery. We're doing pretty good on doctors recently despite how we started. For trading, not a bad setup either. You have Penny Fitzgerald running the general goods store. You have Dr. Patricia again here selling medical supplies. And then We also need to consider the fact that trade is made to be intentionally cheap here because of Dr. Rosalind Chambers, who is attempting to attract more travelers here, meaning the trade of the town is forced to operate at a loss, and this hurts the town's economy. It might make it a bit easier for you initially when you show up to get some goods, but it's not good for the town's health. Dr. Rosalind Chambers is the one who's running this sort of anti-synth conspiracy testing situation in the sewers nearby to town. She's the one enforcing a lot of the rules. She has major influence over Covenant. We'll get more into that later. We do have clean water here with a water pump. We do have a pretty solid farm with potatoes, corn, and mute fruits. For safety and defense, we're surrounded by concrete walls, and we have mounted turrets on the walls. This is really good. And then you also have a Mr. Handy, which could offer some sort of defense in Deezer. Maybe he could just splash lemonade on people. For leadership, we do have Mayor Jacob Orden, who might be more of a figurehead. Again, I think Dr. Rosalind Chambers is the one who has the final say on a lot of what goes on in Covenant. For potential work, you could work for the compound maybe as some sort of security. The compound is what Dr. Rosalind Chambers is working out of with their whole anti-synth operation. You could help work on the farm, help one of the businesses in town if needed, or maybe help out with giving the safe test to newcomers. The safe test is what they use to gauge whether a person is a synth or not. Again, you'll notice that this town has deep synth paranoia. Much of the Commonwealth does, of course, but this town in particular really has it kind of working against them, to be honest. And that's what brings us to potential growth. I think they have a really solid setup, but they're hindered by that synth paranoia. It makes themselves a target, not only to the Institute potentially, but to those they incorrectly accuse and torture. You see, if they do suspect that you're a synth, you don't just have to leave town or get away from the settlement altogether. They will capture you and test you. This testing involves torture and imprisonment, and if you start doing this to too many people, you're bound to make some enemies. And if you start doing this to the Institute's synths, you're making yourself a target for arguably the most dangerous faction in all of the East Coast. I think if the Institute wanted to put a concerted effort towards taking out the compound, they would. And if that got Covenant taken out in the process, that wouldn't be surprising either. So again, I just think this works against them, this super anti-synth paranoia that they have. I'm not saying that the people of the Commonwealth shouldn't defend themselves from the Institute, but I think more standard measures of security is better than making yourself an active target against the Institute. None of the individual settlements in the Commonwealth are actually capable of doing anything to the Institute, so I think you're better off minding your own business and protecting yourself, staying out of the way rather than making yourself a direct enemy of them. The people of the Commonwealth don't know this, of course, but your best bet would be to wait for the Brotherhood of Steel to come in and the Railroad to start to make their moves against the Institute, and then potentially support them, because the Institute is a long-term terrible issue for the area, of course, if they're just going to replace everybody and wipe out the Commonwealth. But I don't think, again, that any of the individual settlements can do anything, so wait for some bigger players to enter the scene and bide your time. So when we're ranking Covenant, we have to consider the fact that you have to pass the safe test to enter town, and failure to pass could lead to your torture and death. And the requirements for this test are quite ambiguous. I'm not sure how you actually pass it or don't pass it, because we don't get a clear indication of that in game. I think it's impossible to fail it. So despite Covenant's many positives, this lack of clarity upon entry and the potential that coursers from the Institute could show up and wipe this place off the map any day now is gonna land Covenant at the top of D tier. With that being said, we move on to the big boy, the green jewel of the Commonwealth, Diamond City. Housing here isn't too bad. You have home plate, but you need to earn the ability to purchase a home in town. And then you have some exposed shacks near the farms. This would give you a place to sleep at least, and something to get out of the rain. Then you could also stay at the Dugout Inn, or maybe move into Kellogg's old house. That might be a bad idea though. We do have a doctor in town in Dr. Sun, but you also have Dr. Crocker, who is a clear negative. He might kill you. For trading, you have a ton. You have the Diamond City Market with Arturo Rodriguez selling weapons and guns. You have Becky Fallon selling clothing. You have Mo Cronin selling melee weapons and baseball bats. You have Myrna, who runs the general goods store. She might not sell to you if she thinks you're a synth, but then maybe you just stop by at night and buy from her robot Percy. You also have Polly the Butcher, who's a food vendor. You have Solomon, who sells chems. Takahashi, who sells just noodles. then Vadim and Scarlet work the bar and sell drinks, and then finally you have Henry Cook in Wellingham running the Colonial Tap House in the upper stands. This is another bar. We have a great water source with a big water purifier in a flooded section of the fields. For food, we have 2 Brahmin and a really big farm with a bunch of potatoes and mute fruit being run. For safety and defense, you have the Diamond City security team, which helps defend the city inside and out on the perimeter of it. The town is within Fenway Park, making it significantly more defensible than most other towns. Of course, you have the giant metal gate, which lowers and raises. Nick Valentine and his detective agency would be a huge bonus to the safety and defense, but he's missing whenever we arrive in Diamond City, and he seems largely reliant on the sole survivor saving him, so I don't think that we can factor that in too much. We're also in downtown Boston, which is dense with super mutants and raiders, so leaving the city doesn't seem like a great idea, but within the city you seem largely safe. Kind of, that's always relative with the Institute present, and we have to consider the fact that leadership is under Mayor McDonough, who is a synth. For potential work, of course, you're going to have a lot of options as you would in one of these larger cities. You could help out one of the businesses in town, maybe start your own, although that might be difficult given the amount of competition you have in here. There are some wanted posters within town for merc work if you're interested in getting good with a gun, but again, that's going to be really dangerous. You could help work on the farm, help out with maintenance, maybe paint the green wall with that old grumpy guy out back, and maybe even join the Diamond City security. Hopefully you can get some detail on the inside and not have to go on the outside. And again, since Nick is missing, maybe you could take over as the local detective, although again, dangerous. For potential growth, Diamond City is great. There's a lot of room to grow within the stadium. I don't think all the space is used properly, so you could definitely expand upon the amount of people here, especially given they're self-sufficient. They have a water purifier, they have a large farm, an expansive security force. This is a really good place. The major negative is the fact that the mayor is a synth and the whole town could be compromised by the Institute. You do have some institutions like the Public Occurrences acting as the press to work against this, and if Nick Valentine does escape, he could also be a huge benefit to working against them as well. You do have some class issues between the lower fields and the upper stands. If you recall the Fallout 3 video, or have just played Fallout 3, you'll see how Bethesda likes to do this. They did something very similar with Rivet City. But like I said in the Capital Wasteland video, class issues in social stratification are not on the same level of starving and being killed by raiders when it comes to issues among towns, so we're not going to hold it against it too much. The mayor being a synth is a pretty big issue, but anybody could be replaced by a synth, so I don't know how to hold that relative to the other locations. So for now, I'm just going to put Diamond City in A tier. It could move up to S, but I'm just going to put it in A for now, maybe until we get to the end and we'll do some reconsidering. Next, we'll move on to the twin city of Diamond City, Goodneighbor. For housing here, you have the Hotel Rexford. Perhaps you could clear out one of the old warehouses or abandoned buildings, but you might get killed by triggermen. Worst comes to worst, you could live in a shack on the street. Seems like other people are doing that anyway. For trading here, it's no Diamond City market, but it's better than most other places in the Commonwealth. You have Daisy selling general goods. You have Fred Allen, who's a chem dealer. You have Cleo, who sells weapons, Rufus Rubens, who sells junk, and then Whitechapel Charlie selling drinks out of the third rail. The water situation in Fallout 4 is kind of confusing me. I mean, it was one of the most relevant aspects to Fallout 3 in the Capital Wasteland, and then it becomes almost completely irrelevant once we get to Fallout 4 here in Boston. I can't seem to find a place to actually drink from in Goodneighbor, not out of the sinks or the toilets, because this just isn't a function in this Fallout like it is in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. So I'm guessing you have to acquire it through water. Now, we kind of ran into a similar issue in Vault 81, but I didn't mention it because vaults have purifiers. I'm assuming the people there have access to water, even if it isn't really a function in game, because it's not really a function in Fallout 4. It's strange. In the other Fallout games, I would just walk into town, find a place to drink from, and sample it. If I got radiation while drinking, I would consider it, yes, it has a water source, but it's irradiated. If I drank from it and I didn't get any radiation, then of course we have a clean water source on site, but I can't really do that in Fallout 4. You don't have the same kind of option in game. You can walk up to puddles and ponds and drink from those, but you can't do that here in Goodneighbor. There isn't a puddle or a pond. So I'm kind of stuck. I don't know what to do. You can see sinks here. You can see that they have some sinks and toilets in the bathroom. And again, in other Fallout games, you'd be able to walk up to these and drink out of them, but I can't do that here. So I'm not sure. I don't want to hold it against them too much because they would be one of the only locations so far that doesn't have a clean water source, and would it really be that hard for them to put down one of the water pumps that so many of the other locations have done? I don't know. So for this, I suppose we just put no, they don't have a clean water source. You either acquire some pure water through trade or you drink out of the old water pipes, the old water system from the pre-war, which has consistently been irradiated in most of the fallouts. So yeah, that's the case here, no clean water source. For food, again, no significant food source either. It must be acquired through trade. They don't have any farms in town. They don't have a Brahmin here. It's really bad. For safety and defense, we do have this walled off little section of the city, and you do have the neighborhood watch who walks around and helps defend the town, but you do have groups like the triggermen here in the town. The alleyways are dangerous to walk down, the warehouses are dangerous to enter, and you get threatened as soon as you walk into Goodneighbor. Of course, there are a bunch of raiders, super mutants, and gunners all around the downtown area, so leaving town would be a bad idea, but I think you're generally safe from those groups as long as you're within Goodneighbor. The problem is there's a lot of internal dangers here, so it's not great in terms of safety and defense. For leadership, we have John Hancock. Now, some of you might like him, you might like his personality, but at the end of the day, he is a violent, loose cannon chem fiend who is willing to leave his settlement for long stretches of time, so I don't think he's a great leader. For potential work, you could go try and scrap and scavenge in the downtown ruins. I'm sure there's a lot to get your hands on, but that would be very risky, of course. Maybe you could join the neighborhood watch. Hopefully you could try and start a farm or get some sort of water source working, because this would make you very useful to the community, but that might be difficult to do because of a lack of soil or infrastructure. And again, given we have a decent population within something of a city, you could maybe get a job at one of the local businesses or start one of your own. For potential growth, it's not terrible, but it could be precarious. You could get a lot of people who don't make it into Diamond City, get rejected for whatever reason, potentially being a ghoul, but Goodneighbor does attract a lot of untrustworthy, dangerous sorts, so that's not great for its health. It's difficult to find clean work here. I think the fact that leadership here is very questionable and you have no farming or apparent clean water source means this place could become overpopulated, and that could lead to a lot of infighting and dangerous situations, so I don't love the potential for growth. With that being said, I think that if you know how to mind your business, you could make yourself a decent life in Goodneighbor. And this is having me reconsider a lot of our list, so I'm gonna make a couple moves here. I'm gonna move Diamond City up into S tier. I think it belongs there. Maybe it'll get resituated as we proceed, but I doubt it. Then we're gonna move Bunker Hill up into A tier. We're gonna move the Slog and Abernathy Farm into B tier. Then I'm going to put Goodneighbor in C tier and above Vault 81, strictly because you're not going to get turned away at their gates. That's very debatable. I think you could make a strong case for Vault 81 ending up higher on the list, but I think it's kind of a similar situation to the Tenpenny Towers one in the Fallout 3 video, where I just think its accessibility hurts it. I think the likelihood that you just get turned away is so high that I can't really justify putting it above C tier. On the same note, you might be better off getting turned away from Goodneighbor given the state of its interior, so this could go both ways. We're not done yet. We still got quite a few settlements to take a look at, so let's go to the Adam Cat's garage, where a bunch of goofball greasers are hanging out in power armor. For housing, they're stationed in an old Red Rocket gas station and have a warehouse building out back. Then you also have Zeke's trailer, so that gets some extra room in the other buildings. And then I think you could maybe take up residence in this partially destroyed bus in the back. You could refit it and use it for your own home maybe. The Adam Cats do not have a doctor, but they do have a bit of trading. Blue Jay, he has a decent inventory, and then you have Rowdy, who trades mostly in power armor equipment. They don't have a clean water source of any sort, it doesn't seem, and they don't have any food either. I think they get most of their necessities from the Warwick homestead, which we'll get to next. These two settlements seem to work together on some level. For safety and defense, they have a chain link fence with some additional makeshift walls for barricading. They of course have their power armor, which is a huge benefit to them, but they're often targeted by gunners and raiders because of that power armor, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And they also have this vantage point on top of the Red Rocket gas station that they have stairs built up to, so that's a benefit to them as well. For the leader of the Adam Cats, we have Zeke, who is also their founder. Does anybody else find the Adam Cats completely uninteresting? I think any faction that makes an identity around power armor has to be cool. You can't mess around with this. They have to be a cool faction, but Bethesda managed to make a really lame faction here. And I really can't put my finger on why. Why is it that a faction like the Kings from New Vegas I can find pretty interesting and neat, but then a faction like the Atom Cats, who are kind of similar in tone and style, are just really annoying? Let me know what you think. Maybe you disagree, that's fine. For potential work, you could run errands between the Atom Cats and the Warwick homestead. That seems to be a necessity. And then you could also hopefully start a farm for them, maybe get some water pump or a purifier going to make them more self-sufficient and not reliant on the Warwick homestead. Then maybe you could help Rowdy work on power armor and gain an understanding of those systems. That wouldn't be a bad skill set for the wasteland. For potential growth, as long as you act like an idiot, I think they would let you live with them. They have no farm, no water pump, seem largely reliant on trade, so it's not great for growth in that regard. And then they do have pretty minimal room. Something of a living quarters could be set up, but in terms of large population expansion, it's not great. And before we rank it, I'm gonna move on to the Warwick homestead because these are kind of a pairing settlement together, and then we'll rank them at the same time. The housing at Warwick has 6 beds in a large concrete structure, which is a big benefit on their end, but there are currently 6 residents there, so you'd need to find your own mattress and figure something out in that regard. You do have some extra building space on the other side of the farms, and there is a couch. Not the worst situation in the world. They don't have a doctor. They do have trading with June Warwick, but she has a limited inventory. They do have a clean water source with their water pump. And then for food, their farm is really solid. They have gourds, mute fruit, potatoes growing in a thriving farm with good soil. Again, it must be a good farm setup because they have enough to give to the Atom Cats. For safety and defense, I'm sure they could get some support from the Atom Cats in their power armor, but they are right next to the Northern Star Raiders. They like right next to them. That can't be a good situation. And they also mention attacks from super mutants. It's also worth noting that Warwick and the Atom Cats are very close to the Quincy ruins, which is one of the largest locations for gunners in the game. For their leadership, you have June Warwick, who is the trader in town as well, but you also have Roger Warwick, who is an Institute synth. He's been replaced. He was previously a bit of a deadbeat drunk, and then he was replaced by the Institute, and his behavior entirely changed. He's very positive. He'll follow you around the settlement and try and talk to you if you go there, and he helps out a lot with the farming. It's also noted that his family noticed he doesn't sleep anymore, which he says is just, his work ethic and a bit of insomnia. The Institute, as they do, captured and tortured the real Roger, and they're now testing out a genetically modified gourd within the Warwick homestead. Another resident, Bill Sutton, who's not a part of the Warwick family, has noticed that Roger is strange, and he's on to what the Institute is doing here, and he's trying to get the rest of the settlement to understand. The potential for work here is quite standard. Again, you could run errands back and forth to the Atom Cats, but this time for the Warwick homestead, help out on the farm, defend the town, and maybe expose Roger as the Institute implant that he is. And despite these guys having a good water and farm setup, I don't think the potential for growth is great. I mean, of course, you have Roger, who's a part of the Institute, which they could end up wiping out this settlement whenever they see fit, but then you also have the Gunners and Raiders, which are right next to them and would make it hard for any newcomers to make it to this settlement. I did notice there's a decent bit of extra space for expansion into other buildings and portions of the water plant, so you do have that going for it. But I think it's also worth noting that if we look on the map here, these guys and the Atom Cats are kind of cornered on their little peninsulas that they sit on. If the Gunners from Quincy wanted to take them out or take them over, they would really be in a bad situation. They're stuck at the end of these peninsulas. The Atom Cats could hop in the water as long as they had enough suits of power armor and just kind of walk away very slowly, but the people at the Warwick homestead would be stuck. And I think the Warwick homestead's association with the Atom Cats ends up hurting them. The Gunners want the equipment from the Atom Cats, and because it might be difficult to make a direct assault against them, they might use the weakness of the Warwick homestead's defensibility as leverage against the Atom Cats, who seem to care about them on some level. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you have the Raiders sitting right next to them in the crashed Northern Star. I would say that these settlements should join together more securely and get closer, but the Warwick homestead requires the soil there for their farms, and the Atom Cats need the infrastructure available in the garage and warehouse for their power armor, so I don't know how much of an option that really is. They'd have to sacrifice a part of what makes the settlements useful to come together. Maybe at some point the pair of them could retreat all the way over to Spectacle Island, but for now I'm going to put the Warwick homestead at the top of D tier, and I'm going to put the Adam Cats just behind them above Covenant in D tier. This one is difficult to decide, but I'm mainly going with this because the Warwick homestead is very self-sufficient. They have a good setup, they have a large concrete home, and they're kind of safe on that end, even though they are close to raiders and the gunners do pose some sort of threat to them. The Adam Cats have made direct enemies with the gunners, it seems. That's a big no-no. But then Covenant is going to sit behind them because they've made direct enemies with the Institute, which is arguably much worse. But then Oberland Station and the rest down through Finch Farm are going to stay below them, especially Warwick Home, because they have worse housing situations and worse farms. Okay, and this brings us even further to the south with Somerville Place. For the housing here, we have one old abandoned single-story home with 3 beds for the 3 current residents, who is 1 adult male and 2 children. There's no doctor here, no trading, they do have a water pump, and they have a decent-sized corn farm. When it comes to safety and defense for the Somerville Place, it's going to tank this location. It's very minimal. They have no walls or legitimate fencing aside from the fence surrounding their corn. They're right next to the Scrap Palace, full of super mutants. They're near Vault 95, which is a big location for the gunners. They're very close to the glowing sea and all the dangers it poses, not to mention radiation. And they're also right on the border of the swamps or marshlands, whatever they're called here, which are full of terrible creatures. You also have the Gunner Plaza not too far away either. This place is in between so many terrible locations, it might even beat out Finch Farm, but we'll get there later. For leadership, not really. They have 1 man and his 2 kids. I suppose you could say that the dad is the leader, but I caught this guy sitting inside while the kids are out working the farm. What's he doing? For potential work, you could help the kids out on the farm, help fix up their old home, maybe build some defenses, but I think you should probably just leave. I also noticed some radstag nearby, but again, dangerous swamp area. You could get killed trying to hunt out there. For potential growth, horrible location. This is just bad. It's very close to the glowing sea and the swamps. This place is gonna get wiped out, so I'm putting it in F tier below Finch Farm. But believe it or not, that's not our lowest rated location. The crater of Adam is terrible. I died just surveying this place from radiation. For some reason, a group of people decided to live in the middle of the glowing sea at ground zero for a nuclear detonation. For housing here, you have a bunch of metal and wooden shacks and bedrolls. You also have this one building in the middle of an irradiated pool of water. There is no doctor here. You do actually have trading with Brother Ogden. There's no clean water source, of course, but you could maybe drink from that irradiated pool if you wanted to die a little faster. There's no food here, and for safety and defense, you're in a crater, so I suppose that's something you're a little bit harder to see than if you were just in an open field. I have in my notes here, radiation is killing everyone. What the fuck is going on? Adam must be real because these people are alive. There's some whole extra rabbit hole to go down here into the reality of Adam because nothing else would be keeping them on their feet. Within the glowing sea, it's just incredibly dangerous, so that has to be factored in as well for safety and defense. The leadership is under Mother Isolde, and then you have Brother Hoberman, who was sent to investigate the presence of Virgil, but he seems to have died. Now, he wasn't a leader or anything, but she sent him to go inspect Virgil and got him killed, so not the best leadership. She's, of course, insane. For potential work, you could dig your own grave, hopefully in time to fall in it, and then the potential for growth is no. This is absolutely F tier, and the bottom of it shouldn't even exist. Dead. In fact, no, that's not good enough. It's not in F tier. We're making a new tier. We're putting it in Z tier. I suppose you could argue that if you go here and pray to Adam, you'll live, but you can be the one to test that out. I think you'll win a Darwin Award. So there are the 17 ranked towns across the Commonwealth. We have Diamond City in S tier, which I think is fitting. Bunker Hill in A tier, the Slog and Abernathy Farm in B tier. Abernathy being in B is surprising to me, but I think it's just generally safe and out of the way. It's not surrounded by a bunch of dangers. Goodneighbor and Vault 81 in C tier for very different reasons. Then in D tier we have Warwick Homestead, the Adam Cats Garage, Covenant, Oberland Station, and Greentop Nursery. F tier is home to Tenpines Bluff, County Crossing, Nordhagen Beach, Finch Farm, in Somerville Place. And then for the first time ever, we have Crater of Adam down in Z tier, right where it belongs. Now, there are a few other places we might have been able to include in this list. Some of these locations are Grey Garden, which was only comprised of robots, so I didn't include it in the list. Then we have spots like Cabot House or the Nakano Residence, which are exclusively home to single families in strange single standing homes. This is something Bethesda likes to do, where they have groups of people or even just single individuals living in a house like it's not the post-apocalypse. Now, you could definitely argue this and say a bunch of the settlements on this list only have 2 or so people in them, so what's the difference? And I think the difference is that they're the beginnings of a settlement that could grow into something else, whereas Cabot House and the Nakano Residence are people's houses. And then you also have a place like Charles View Amphitheater, which is home to the Pillars of the Community, but this is an active scam, so I figured we'd omit it from the list of towns. And then finally, maybe the one location that has the best argument to be on the list is the Drumlin Diner, but this is a business. It's not really a settlement. It doesn't seem like they're looking to accept new people or have an active functioning town going on to begin with. There's no farm here. Doesn't seem to be any flowing water, nothing like that. They're not even defending themselves. It's another one of those strange locations, not too different from Cabot House or the Nakano Residence. Those 3 locations, there's something that Bethesda does where it's almost like they just disregard the world around them, like nothing could touch them. They exist in some strange little bubble. I don't get it, and I really don't like their inclusion, so maybe that has to do with why I didn't put them on the list. All right, I have to get this report back to my employer in the Mojave so I can get paid. I have a long trip ahead of me. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions on the subject matter or whatever you feel like yapping about. That's cool too. If you enjoyed the report, liking and subscribing helps us out over here at nvRanger & Co. Regardless, I'll see you in the comments.